So the children's story, I hope you had some fun with that, and just seeing, you know, Martin Luther and the Pope and John Calvin and David Ferenz live. I mean, that's kind of a treat. The thing of it is, you didn't get the whole story there. It wasn't exactly a fairy tale the way the ending ended up. I'm going to fill in a little bit of details for you. So King Sigismund, so if you know anything about Hungary, it's just this very complicated history, because it's at the crossroads of the Middle East or the Asia Minor and Europe, and so it gets invaded a lot. Lots of different people take over from time to time. And so this particular story, King Sigismund was actually crowned king of Hungary. And so at that, by the way, at that point in time, you have to realize that Hungary was split into three parts. So Hungary, like Budapest, Hungary, was part of the Habsburg Empire. So it was totally and very strictly Roman Catholic. And then there was a part of Hungary that is today part of Serbia, Belgrade, that kind of space down there. The Ottoman Empire owned that part of it. And then Transylvania ended up being this province unto itself. So it was rather autonomous at this point in history, as long as they kept paying taxes to the Ottoman Empire so that they wouldn't invade them. So you kind of had these three parts to it. So King Sigismund ended up being crowned king of Hungary, the Budapest part, when he was an infant, because there was no heir to the throne and that kind of thing. And Queen Isabella, who actually came from Poland, was kind of in charge of all of this. And then when he was 16, he ended up being the prince also of Transylvania, but for all de facto purposes was the king of Transylvania at the age of 16. So by the time the Edict of Torda came along, and this all happened with all these people, his mother had died 2 years earlier, and he was 28 when he proclaimed this. And so it was a really cool thing. Now, it says freedom of religion, but you had to be one of the recognized religions. So the four that I had up here, Roman Catholic, Calvinist, Lutheran, or Unitarian was all that applied. There was no anything else in there. So it wasn't exactly what we would think of today for Unitarian Universalism, but it was a very good start, and it was the very first time that religious tolerance had been proclaimed in a very legal way as an edict in Europe. Well, King Sigismund, unfortunately, he went for a horse ride and unfortunately got in a tragic accident 2 years later and died in 1570 at the age of 30. So when he died, then the Roman Catholics took over again, and so things weren't exactly peachy. So we had 2 years of an Edict of Torda that was in existence, but even then, in Transylvania, they still had a little bit more freedom, in that they didn't say everybody had to become now Roman Catholic, but they said that they twisted the law to basically say, when that edict was proclaimed, whatever your doctrine was at that point, and whatever hymns you had, whatever you did at that point can never be changed, because that's the only thing that's free. And so you could never evolve to anything else. Well, then that's where another character I need to explain, and how David Ferenz got into trouble. So in the background, there's this dude, Giorgio Biandrata. So he comes from a very wealthy Italian family, and he was actually a doctor, a physician, and he was Unitarian and humanist. I've heard him referred to as humanist, and then I've heard to him as Unitarian, although that name didn't really exist at the time. So I think humanist is really what he was. But it was really his ideas about religious tolerance and Unitarianism that had the biggest influence on David Ferenz, and frankly on his mother first, because he was the court physician for a long, long time. Well, he was also very opportunistic. So when things went south and the king died, he was kind of quick to back off on things, and I won't go into all the intrigue, but at the end of the day, he ended up being able to go back to Italy with a lot of money, and David Ferenz, because he had decided that he wanted to change an element of doctrine. Essentially, I'll make this up because this is the easiest way for me to understand it. you would never close a prayer with, and in Jesus' name we pray, because he said, why are we praying to Jesus? Jesus was human, he's not God, he should be only talking to God. And by leaving off that phrase, he was a heretic. They locked him up in a citadel in Deva, Transylvania, and he was sick. I mean, you know, this is a citadel, it's not heated, he doesn't get food, and by November he died. And so that's kind of how this twisted little history went. And so when I was over there for this pilgrimage, it ended with, on a Saturday afternoon, with, I think it ended up being 1,600 people climbing up to the top of the citadel to have this 3-hour-long service in Hungarian. And yeah, it was all in Hungarian. Once in a while they translate something to Romanian and English for us, but and then they had in the cell of the citadel, there's like a tombstone to commemorate him, and everybody got a little candle, and they were lighting candles. But what I found out from that is David Ferenc almost got erased from history. Like, people really didn't remember him, they had forgotten him, and it wasn't until the 19th century that people began to remember him and think about it, and no one actually knows what he looks like. You saw, who was David Ferenc? Yeah, you saw Jeff hold up this picture. So this is a gift actually from one of the ministers in a partner church. It's a puzzle, a 450-piece puzzle of, or 450-piece puzzle of the 450th anniversary of the Edict of Torda. This is the only thing that we know of. It's a painting, and the artist made up what he looks like. So this really never happened. We don't really know what he looks like, but that's how forgotten he was. But over time, they realized that this was an important part of not just Unitarian history, but Hungarian Unitarians, and then in Europe, because it's a part of the history of Europe. So that's why we were there. I'm going to give you a little bit of a context, I think. I've already done a little bit of it. For those of you that don't know anything about Transylvania, I didn't even want to tell people where I was going before I left, because if I do, I get the Count Dracula comments, and I'm like, you know, I just don't even want to deal with this right now. So after I left, a buddy of mine that I work out with was at the gym, and he told the coach, because I told the coach I was going to be gone for 2 weeks, I was going to Europe, and he goes, you know, like, la-di-da, right? And he told him he was in Transylvania, and the coach said, I didn't even know that was a real place. Just made up. So it's one of these places. Transylvania lies at the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. And so the plains of the Carpathian Plateau is where the Hungarians, or the Magyars, came from further east and conquered it 1,100 years ago. So this is long settled by the Hungarians, but it's been fought over for centuries at the same time. It's one of the most fought over territories in the world because it lies right in the pathway of all of these things. So at the time, you know, you think about, well, if the Habsburgs had one part of Hungary and the Ottomans had another part, and Transylvania was this autonomous part, was it really that courageous to try to do religious freedom, or did they just have to do religious freedom because it was such a blend and a mix of people anyway? It was probably going to start a fight. So that you kind of have to ask that. But I do have to say that it was visionary that such a community could exist. Because if you think about it, then the prime example that comes to mind would be when the Moors were in Spain up until the century before, which then ended really poorly with the Inquisition and the Jews and the Muslims being forced out of Spain. So then just, you know, about 60, 70 years later, to think that you could try to do a community where everybody's supposed to get along was actually, I think, kind of visionary. So what can we learn from the Edict of Torda today? I think, you know, we're not getting along so well today either religiously or even in governments these days. And so I think it was a very telling anniversary for this point in time, and our tour guides kept pointing out that Europe is turning very nationalistic. Each little country is being very nationalistic, and there's this huge tension between Romania and Hungary because at the end of World War I, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory, and it was ceded to the countries around it. So back then it was Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and then Romania got the big chunk of it. And so there's ethnic Hungarians living in Transylvania. So hang with me here. At 1918, so the end of World War I, Transylvania was 90% Hungarian. Today it's 20% Hungarian, 80% Romanian. And so there's a lot of animosity, and why do I keep mixing this Hungarian Unitarian thing? Because in Transylvania is where the Hungarian Unitarians are. It's not all over Hungary. All of this happened in this one province. So there's a lot of mixing and blending here between national identity and I'm Hungarian and I'm Unitarian, and where does one start and one stop? In fact, at one point we sat down with the two ministers and just started talking kind of theology and what do Unitarians over there believe, and I'll get into that more in a minute. But the minister said, okay, here's what we, as the official, what Unitarians believe, but if you asked one of the older Hungarians, they wouldn't probably give you that answer. It would probably sound something more like what the Roman Catholics believe, because to them, they're Hungarian first, and whatever the religion is, how it shakes out is not that important. So that's just a little bit of a context of the space. So I want to show you some slides before I move on to the next part of it. So yeah, can you see that, or do we need to shut off the light?
Yeah.
Too? Okay, is that good?
Yep.
All right. So on your far left is the church in Torda. So this is where this whole, the Edict of Torda is just the proclamation that came out of the conference, but this conference went on for a couple of months, and all the nobles and all the clerics and all that kind of stuff came to this church every day, and they debated over how they should govern themselves. So that, it's your classic kind of Baroque church in Europe, but that's Torda. And you can see the plaque in the middle. I think the top is Romanian, because it's now in Romania. Top is Romanian, then Hungarian, and then English at the bottom. And I think there's a typo in it too, or they corrected the typo, which is kind of interesting. Everywhere we went, the English was always slightly off, which just made us laugh. The thing on the right, I think, is really the most important, and I don't know if you can see it. This whole church is under renovation. We actually couldn't go in it, and there's scaffolding everywhere. So it's hard to make out the scaffolding versus the sculpture. So this is on the eastern side of the church, and it's a sculpture that looks like a ladder. Does everybody see what I'm looking at? And so the interpretation is essentially that culture, European culture, is evolving, and it's upward and onward kind of thing, is the way the sculpture has it depicted. And it's all steps, it's all ladders of things along the way. And you can see just basically it looks like a ladder to a bunk bed, up until you get to, there's a chunk there, and it's more solid, and I think it actually looks like a keyhole, but I can't remember exactly. And from that point on, the rim, what do you call those? Rungs, thank you. The rungs of the ladder become looser until eventually they open up at the top. And there's two interpretations, or two sides to it. One side it looks like birds getting ready to fly, and the other side looks like flowers or wheat or something about ready to blossom. So it's to signify that that the Edict of Torda is part of an ever ongoing progression of civilization in Europe, that once that happened, it was the first time to try to do religious tolerance, which was the beginning of helping to open up culturally in Europe. So it's a brand new sculpture that was just dedicated this year. There's a number of ceremonies.
And the birds, when I saw that, it kind of communicates the journey leads to freedom.
If everybody heard that, the birds look like the journey leads to freedom. Yeah, that's very good. Yes, and so that was, thank you, Barbara. Those were words that were often brought up, that David Ferenc and King Sigismund, this was an edict all about tolerance and freedom, and they go hand in hand. Very good. Okay, then let me transition into more of this pilgrimage that we did. So you can see these are folks, these are gray jacket and the teal coat in front, those are all folks from the Appleton congregation. And they're down, not at the very, very bottom of the hill, but pretty far down. And you can see how high up this citadel is. I mean, this is a rock in the center of this town. And we're in Deva now. And so the Appleton Church, their partner congregation is in Deva. And that was very intentional. I'll talk about why that happened. And then in the center, you can see the actual citadel is the cylindrical building. And so it has a cell in the bottom of it. And that's where he was imprisoned. And then you can see the grave marker. It's not, no one knows where he's buried. They don't have any idea. So they put this commemorative grave marker there, and then you can see, I mean, I got there early. I was one of the first ones to light a candle, and you can already see it's this river of wax and flame already, and it's kind of a contained area, and so the smoke and the heat was pretty intense when you went in there. And then on the right-hand side, you can see in this, it's a fortress that they've left as a relic, right? They haven't made it Disneylandish or anything like that. And so the roof, the beams are open, and we had the service up there, and you can see the man on the far right with the really long hair. That's Zoli Kopandi. He's the minister at the David Church. So he's the minister of our partner congregation. And then you can see down below, they had certain groups dressed up in traditional costumes that were part of this pilgrimage up to the top as well. So that's just a sampling of it. Then flip to the next slide. There you go. So a week before I left, Zoli asked me if I'd like to preach. And I'm like, well, sure. I think that'd be kind of a cool thing. And I was going to kind of write a little bit of it along the way. Well, within 2 days of being there, our tour guide, who was leading us to all these pilgrimage sites, I told him that I was preaching, and he said, well, Zoli's actually not very good at translating to English spontaneously. Why don't you send him your sermon ahead of time? Well, you know me, I don't write sermons, I write bullet points. And so I'm like, dang, now what do I do? So late at night, I'm writing this, I borrowed a computer, and I'm writing this out. Instead of going up a mountaintop walk that my wife went on, I was typing this thing and getting it proofread and all that kind of stuff. Got it to somebody to translate into Hungarian, and it worked out really, really well, because then Zoli could just read the Hungarian. I'd read a paragraph, then he'd read a paragraph. And so that's the two of us preaching. It's the only picture I've seen, and it looks like I'm really confused, so I'm just really, really happy with that. You can also see this is not the congregation, this is the Appleton group. This is the group I traveled with for 2 weeks. And this is their sanctuary. And so I told Zoli there's a ton of parallels between Fond du Lac, Open Circle congregation, and that congregation. One is it's relatively new. They had almost died away. There was no Unitarian congregation in the town when communists fell in 1989, and the Appleton Church got paired with them because, I'll make this quick, way back between the world wars, there was an American woman who married a Hungarian Unitarian minister and lived in this little village called Metzger. And they worked really, really hard, and it was horribly depressed and all this kind of stuff. He finally died of tuberculosis. She came back to America, settled in Appleton, Wisconsin, and founded the fellowship up in Appleton. So there's this really bizarre connection, and that congregation was already taken by Boise, Idaho. And so they said, well, there's this other one that's really important because they've got this citadel, and we expect there to be a lot of pilgrimages. Would you like to take this on? So that congregation met them like back in 1992-ish, and they had nothing, and they dreamt of purchasing a home and renovating it and turning it into a church. So just like you guys have like this little kind of strip mall thing going on, and you converted it, this was this rundown home that they completely converted, and they're also building a guest house on the top floor. Because they know that a lot of Unitarians from the U.S. and around the world are going to come to visit, and it's a little bit of a money generator for them. It seems to be the way the Unitarian churches survive over there. So their congregation is almost the same exact size, and they also have about the same attendance every Sunday morning. And Zoli also has 2 other congregations that he has to go to as well. So I'm like, I think there's something here. I think we should try to have you guys come over and meet this congregation because they're just delightful. So that's what I was on. So I want to talk a little bit about the pilgrimage and go back to courage here for a second. So this is excerpts from the sermon that I did when I was there, because they wanted to know, why would you go on a pilgrimage? And if you think about it, why would we go to a country whose culture we barely understand, whose language we haven't a clue? Hungarian is a very hard language. I was reading along while he was talking. I'm like, I have no idea how to decipher how to read this. And I speak German and English, and I can do some French. It was a crazy thing. And just take this big risk and go on this pilgrimage on the other side of the world. So the first Sunday that we were there, in between breakfast and before we went to the mother church of Hungarian Unitarianism in Kolozsvár, I got our group together and I asked them, so why are you going on this pilgrimage? And they gave me 3 reasons, and we kept coming back to those over the week, and I want to share those with you. So the first one was Christian roots. So unlike Hungarian Unitarians, all of them were born Unitarian, have stayed with the faith their whole life, and will die Unitarian. There's hardly ever any converts into it, and it would have to be by marriage. And usually you go, I forget whether you go to the father or the mother's church. So, I mean, there's all these rules of how it's done. And I told them, well, in our group, out of the 16, only one person could say that they were born Unitarian, and that was the 16-year-old that was coming with us and traveling with their mother. So, unlike them, most of us were converts. And I said, many of us come from Christian backgrounds, and myself included, where maybe the theology that I came from no longer made sense to me, but I still liked the smells and bells of it. I liked the music. I liked, some of the rituals of it. And I said, so a lot of the folks wanted to come because Hungarian Unitarians are still Christian. They haven't evolved. We've evolved into more of this universalist kind of path in the way we've done it in America, and we're open to many religious traditions. In fact, we've de-emphasized Christianity, and they didn't understand that. And I said, so a lot of us have come to see, well, how does Unitarianism work when you're still Christian? And there's an interesting example. Zoli, I first met him about 10 years ago when he was in the U.S. for a whole year. He got a scholarship to come to one of our seminaries, and he came to Appleton for Christmas. And so we decided to do Unitarian communion on Christmas Eve at the late service, and they asked me to help. And so now for 10 years, the last service is the one and only time we ever do communion in the fellowship up there. And it was the first time they'd done communion in 50 years. They had never done communion. So it's one of the things that this congregation gives us. Another one is just history. I admitted to them that Americans are really lousy at history. We're a relatively young country, and we're founded on a focus of always looking forward. What's the next big thing? We rarely look back, and most people don't know our history very well, let alone world history. In fact, my spouse said that she confessed that she works at a nursing home out in Wapaka, and she was going to be gone for 2 weeks. And people go, well, where are you going? And she would say, well, I'm going to Hungary. And then they'd want to go, well, why are you going to Hungary? And she was afraid to tell them because she just doesn't want to, it's a pretty conservative part of the world. Everybody's either Lutheran or Catholic, and didn't really want to say the word Unitarian because she was going to have to explain it. And she said that as the trip got closer and closer, she got braver and braver because she started learning more about these people and said, you guys, you've been persecuted, put to death, burned at the stake, all kinds of stuff for centuries. And here I'm afraid to tell my patient, who's 80 years old while I'm working with them, she's a physical therapist, what I'm doing. And so she got braver and braver, and I used that and I said, because you are here and you are vibrant and strong, even if you're small, we take heart in knowing that you're here and that tangentially you're part of our faith history, and we're very proud of that. And then the last one was just connection. So this partner church between Appleton and David is one of the strongest in the whole organization in the Unitarian Universalist Partner Church Council. And They do a pilgrimage over there about every couple of years. In fact, at one point when they were gutting this place, the whole men's group went over there for a week and just hauled rock and dirt and boards and helped build it. And the stories that they tell are legendary at that time. But every couple of years people go over, and there's been just these great connections that have come between the folks. We had folks on our trip, 3 of them, that this was their 8th trip over. They just always go. It's just an incredible thing to have. So they are just a warm and generous and loving people, and it was just a great thing to be a part of. So that was why we did the pilgrimage. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to end this. After the service at like 11:20, if folks want to come up, I can tell you more about the trip. But I just wanted to talk about, put it in perspective. Like I said before, the struggle for freedom and tolerance exists today all over the world, in society, and even in our congregation here, to be tolerant of everybody's religious path. And I think sometimes I feel like we're in a similar situation with the Ottomans at one door and the Habsburgs on the other door, and we're kind of caught in between with the political realities today. But we have to remember that we have this proud history supporting religious freedom and tolerance. It's a history that required immense courage from our religious ancestors, and it's a position that requires immense courage and patience even today. So I just want to say that I hope that the tolerance, freedom, and love proclaimed by David Ferens be a passion for us as well, now and into our uncertain future. Amen. And now we will go right into a hymn, Find a Stillness.